You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi everyone, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. This is an episode about productivity, and in particular, I'd like to talk about automation and to compare it to delegation. So I'm going to talk about some decisions that you face as an entrepreneur and in life generally, as everyone faces, whenever you want to get things done and be productive. The decision is whether or not you're going to try and delegate work or automate it. Personally, I love automation and I prefer it all the time to delegating. So I'm going to explain my perspective on this, which may give you a slightly different perspective than what you've heard elsewhere. So hopefully that will give you some food for thought. But just to back up for a moment and give a bit of a background to this topic, if you're an entrepreneur, you have no doubt heard many times how important it is to delegate and what a key part of your progress in business this is, and indeed your progress in any project where you are providing some kind of leadership. But in particular, if you're an entrepreneur and if you have a business, a venture, you already know that you have to extract yourself from the day-to-day work. You've got to be able to get above all of that and to work on your business rather than in your business. And I totally agree with this broad message overall. And there's a chapter in my book, Becoming an Entrepreneur, called Make Yourself Redundant, which is all about extracting yourself from workflows. So you've got to do this. And the key way that people generally talk about this, or one of the first way that people talk about it, is through delegation. Getting other people to do things so that you can focus on the bigger picture. And I've done an episode of The Voluntary Life on delegation. In fact, funnily enough, it's the most popular download, is the show that I did called 3 Ways to Delegate, in which I talk about different options that you have for delegating. So if you hadn't heard that one, and this topic is of interest, then I'll put a link in the show notes and you can check that out too. So I won't talk in too much detail about how to delegate, because I've got a whole show on that and talking about the different options. Most of the time when we're talking about delegating work, you're either talking about delegating the crappy tasks that you don't want to do because they're simple, repetitive tasks that are effectively a waste of your creative energy, or we're talking about delegating tasks that you don't have the expertise for, or that you're hiring someone specific for their own expertise. And for those expertise tasks, I'm all for delegation. I'm all for giving somebody else who has a particular skill or a particular creative ability that you don't have, giving that task to them. So, for example, I don't design my own book covers and I don't copy edit my books. I pay other people to do those things because I want their skills, and they're not skills that I have, or that if I try and do them, I'm not going to be nearly as good as those people. But that's not the same as the kind of delegation that a lot of the time people give to virtual assistants, which is, they're just the little bits and bobs tasks that you want done. Those tasks that I think automation does far better than hiring a virtual assistant. This idea that you need to delegate in order to free yourself up is very popular, very widespread. And, one of the typical things that people talk about is using virtual assistants and hiring people online who are going to be able to take care of some of your administrative workload and generally help you focus on the more important tasks and so forth. And Tim Ferriss's book, The 4-Hour Workweek, goes on and on about virtual assistants and how great they are and so forth. However, I'd like to offer a different perspective on this because I try to avoid hiring people whenever I can. I don't like hiring people, even as external contractors. If I can avoid it, I prefer to automate tasks if that is a possibility. And so I want to share with you some of the things that you might be able to do instead of hiring a VA and instead of delegating tasks outwards, that you might be able to automate, and you might find some benefits to that. So let me give you some examples of some of the things that I think can become problematic from delegating to other people or hiring virtual assistants. The real problem for me is that people are complex. Hiring someone to do something sounds easy, but actually people are complicated. They have their own needs. They have their own ideas and views and outlook, and you are adding complexity to your business every time you hire someone to do something. And let me give you an example of the kind of scenario that happens to me all the time that I notice, where I can see bringing virtual assistants in as a situation that just adds to complexity and doesn't actually get the job done more effectively. And that is whenever I'm trying to organize diary appointments or meeting appointments with someone through their VA. You may have experienced this as well. You communicate with somebody via email and you agree that you're going to have a Skype call or you're going to have a meeting, and then you get passed on to their VA to set this up. And then what usually happens is that the original person that you're speaking to is still being copied on this email trail, which then goes into this long, complicated email trail of the virtual assistant comes on and says, okay, how about these dates? And then you say, well, I can do that one. And then they say, well, okay, yeah, we'll fix this date up. And then they send an invite out. And then you and the other person both accept the invite. And then you finally have your date in the diary. Now, I would understand in that kind of situation that may be a hassle for me, the person who is dealing with the VA. But if it saves time for the person who's employing the VA, then I could understand why they do it. But what I notice is that most of the time, the person employing the VA is being copied on this whole email trail anyway. And so they're receiving all of this junk in their inbox that, I mean, unless they're filtering it and deleting it immediately, then it's still taking up mental headspace. And they wouldn't be filtering it because they need to see emails from their VA because they need to communicate with their VA. So anyway, what I'm seeing when I see someone using a virtual assistant like that is I'm seeing an incredibly inefficient process, which to my mind, there are software tools that fix this problem of getting multiple people to agree a time online to meet. There are so many different software tools out there that make this so much easier that to me it's kind of crazy having a person deal with this. And in fact, it's adding another point of failure, it's adding another point of complexity to the whole process. Whereas there are many tools that you can go online where you can expose dates in your diary where you're available for meetings and the person doesn't have to see whatever else is going on in your diary, or you can go and set up 3 different possible times and then have a whole group of people determine which of those 3 they can all make and so forth. And there are loads of tools out there, from the simplest being Google Docs to various other paid commercial services to other free online services. Just Google it and you'll find 100 ways of solving this problem that to me is so much easier than going through this process of delegating a task like managing your own diary. So my preference is always to use a software tool and to automate a process whenever I think it's possible to do so. Because you see, that example with diary management that I just gave is one of the times when oftentimes it feels to me like delegation starts to become more of a status game and more of a kind of a way that some people feel important rather than a way of really getting things done as quickly and as efficiently as possible. Because for me, automation is a far more efficient and far more productive way of solving crappy problems. I mean, that's sort of how our economy works. Progress in our economy works through our processes becoming more capital intensive, to use the technical term, which basically means we use more software and machines and automation and mechanization and more capital intensive procedures to get things done more efficiently, giving us a much more productive use of our time. You know, the delegation model of getting houses clean, in pure terms, is just hire more and more cleaners to do more and more cleaning of your house. The automation model is to get a dishwasher and to get a washing machine and so on and so forth. Now, of course, you may still, in the end, need a cleaner. If you don't want to do any cleaning, you may need someone to come round and do some cleaning. But the point is that what you're doing is you're automating and mechanizing that process to the greatest extent that you can to make it as efficient as possible. And the same applies to all the other processes that you do for your business or for your creative projects or anything else. This is the way that I approach how to be more productive, is I look first to what I can automate and what I can make more efficient through the use of computers and software, machines and robots. And then, failing that, I look at what I can delegate as kind of the leftover stuff that can't yet really be efficiently automated. So what I thought I'd do is I'd give you some examples of the kind of automation tools that I use, and just to really open you up to thinking about how you might apply this kind of approach for yourself to increase your own productivity without adding the complexity of hiring more people to do stuff for you in life. So the first example I want to give you is text expansion, which is an automation app, or a kind of app, which allows you to add a huge amount of text to a document just by typing a very short code word or combination of letters. And so this is a great example of where if you find that you are consistently typing emails to people where you're saying the same thing again and again, then you can use an app like TextExpander, which is an app on the Mac by Smile Software. I'll put a link in the show notes. And there's a different type of app on the PC, but there is an app on the PC that does the same kind of thing. But anyway, when you use this app, you type in a short string of text and it fills out a much longer string of text. So a simple example of where I use text expansion is every time I set up an interview with someone for this podcast, I need to explain to them various things about how we're going to do the podcast. Like I need to remind them, if they can, to wear headphones so that we don't get feedback, and to give them my Skype name, and to ask for their Skype name, and to explain how we're going to do the recording. It's just background information that I need to provide. And each time, I could type that out each time. But I have a text expansion snippet where if I type the letters X Skype, XSKYPE, then a whole paragraph appears in the email that I'm typing, which explains this whole process and all the things that we need to do, and provides all this background information. So I never have to type that again once I've typed it once. And I have the same for things like the directory where I upload podcasts, so that I can type that in very quickly. And I have it for different ways that I sign off emails, and all these other pieces of text that I use repetitively, that I use TextExpander to just with a couple of keystrokes type out a huge amount of text. So if you think that you need to delegate somebody responding to emails because you're having to say the same thing 100 times, then another approach is simply write the thing that you have to say 100 times. And when you receive an email where you're going to give one of those standard responses, then you just do a couple of keystrokes in TextExpander and you will have responded to that email. So that's one example. A great example for automation, and probably my favorite automation app, is an app called Hazel. This runs on the Mac. There is a PC equivalent, or a version that's similar on the PC. I don't know what it's called. You can Google it, but I'll put a link to Hazel in the show notes. And this is a really awesome app, very simple app. What it does is it allows you to script standard procedures for what you do with particular files. And that sounds a bit abstract, but just to explain an example. I have various rules in Hazel. They're called rules, these scripts, which mean that every time I download a bank statement, my computer will automatically look inside that bank statement. It'll find the first date and the last date. It'll rename the statement with a file name that reflects the first date and the last date. And it also says the bank, and it says statement, and names it in the way that I want. And it will then move that file from my downloads folder into the correct folder for all my accounts data. And that all happens without me doing anything. I just download a file and it immediately is renamed and moved and so forth. Similarly, if I download an EPUB, an ebook in EPUB format, then automatically that book will be added to my database of books, which will update it and put all of the name and author details in the right place, and file away that book so that it's saved in my digital library. So that's a lovely app, really, really powerful and really flexible, and it enables you to put your own rules in for handling standard files or procedures that you always do on the same kinds of things. So any time that you have repetitive tasks that you might think about getting someone else to organize for you, if you know what that task is, you can write a simple rule in an app like Hazel and just get your computer to process that file and do the things that you want done to it. And I use Hazel for all sorts of things. So, for example, I also use it when I'm doing podcasting to automatically adjust the levels on the audio files that I produce so that you won't get really loud and really quiet parts. That's a workflow that happens with various things, but mostly with Hazel, that automatically opens up the podcast audio file in an app called Levelator, which then levels the audio and it renames it and so forth. So there's all sorts of things that you can do using an app like Hazel to automatically file away things for yourself and save you time doing little admin tasks that you just don't need to delegate to somebody else. You can just get it to happen automatically on your computer. Another example that I really like is dictation. So I use a couple of apps for dictation. I use an app called Dragon Dictate to dictate text. Sometimes when I don't feel like typing, I just dictate to the computer and Dragon Dictate automatically transcribes what I'm saying, what I'm dictating. And other times I use Dragon Dictate to transcribe the podcasts that I do to get the text in text form if I then want to write up some of the ideas that I'm podcasting about. And I did a lot of that with my book, Becoming an Entrepreneur. Originally, many of the ideas in that book started in podcasts, and then I transcribed them using Dragon Dictate, and then I edited the text and changed it all around, and eventually a book came out of it. I also tried delegating that, and I did hire people to online. I hired virtual assistants to transcribe a few chapters, which worked great, and it was really easy to do, but it's actually just so much faster. Not even having to put the job out and arrange payment afterwards and so forth. It's so much faster for me to use Dragon Dictate that that's just the easiest solution for me. And it's less complicated. It doesn't involve me getting involved in setting up any jobs with other people. I just get it done immediately after doing a podcast. I transcribe it. I also really like using dictation to be able to write things when I'm on the move. So, for example, I use Siri on my iPhone to dictate while I'm listening to an audiobook and having ideas. If I'm going for a walk or rollerblading, then I will stop the audiobook and I will use Siri to take down notes that I have or ideas that I have that I can still do hands-free. And I also have a script to automatically put to-do items, reminders that I use Siri to make note of. Automatically, they go into my task management system, OmniFocus. So you can also use dictation to do things like that, set up reminders and tasks for yourself. And the last example of automation that I wanted to share with you is the kind of scripting that you can do to just create your own automatic procedures for things. And again, because I'm on a Mac, I use AppleScript, which is a Mac scripting language. I use AppleScript for a number of just little things like batch editing of PDF files. Because I'm paperless, I do a lot of scanning of PDF files, and then I use an application to run OCR, optical character recognition, on the things that I scan so that they're searchable PDFs. And when I was scanning a series of books, it was fastest for me to let everything scan through first and then to have an AppleScript that automatically OCR'd a bunch of PDFs overnight, so that my computer was just doing that in the background. I also use AppleScript to automatically update things in Evernote, again combined with the other app that I was telling you about, Hazel. So I get some types of correspondence that I prefer to store in Evernote because it's not really confidential and it's just stuff that I might one day need to refer to. And those kinds of files, when I download them, they automatically go into Evernote. And I use a little bit of AppleScript combined with Hazel to do that. And I'm currently looking into scripting even more things for myself. I've bought an application called Keyboard Maestro, which I haven't started using yet. But that's one of the things that I'm looking into to further automate different procedures for myself. And I think the other thing that I try and do is just generally be as efficient as possible at using my computer. So I learn all of the keyboard shortcuts and combinations that I can, and I have a a process whereby I'm continually trying to improve my own knowledge of those things so that I can be as efficient and productive as possible. So those are some of the examples of the kinds of automation that I'm using. If you're interested in this, there are really good resources out there to use to learn about these kinds of things. Some of my favorite ones are, for example, the podcast Mac Power users. If you're on a Mac, I really recommend checking out that show. They have great stuff on that show about automation, ways to use automation to improve your own productivity and to get your computer to do things for you, rather so that you don't have to, hire a virtual assistant to do them. I also subscribe to a screencast series called Screencasts Online. Again, that's Mac-based, and that's a useful source of information about ways to just be better at using your computer. And I generally tend to look for specific resources for any apps that I'm learning to try and be as productive as possible and find out about scripting them. So that I've also purchased various memberships for other websites that have specific info about different apps. And I would encourage you to look for the information about the apps that you use most as well. Another thing that I'm doing now is I'm using an app called Audacity to automatically do a lot of the podcast editing that otherwise would have to be done manually. And I'll give you an example of that. So I would say 80 or 90% of the editing that I do on these podcasts is simply the removal of silence. Because when I'm doing a podcast, it takes me time to work out what I'm trying to say to you. Even though I make notes, sometimes I need to read my notes while I'm recording the podcast. And it takes me time to read through the notes and have a look at my mind map and have a think about what it was that I was trying to say. And if I leave that in, then there's just going to be lots and lots of gaps in the podcast, which will be no fun to listen to. So 80 or 90% of the editing of a podcast is simply the removal of silence. And that's actually something that you can do automatically in Audacity. And so now what would have been a huge amount of work just to remove silence in a previous app that I was using, GarageBand, I now do all that automatically using one of the features of Audacity. So that's another example of the kinds of things that I look for, ways that I look to automate as much as possible in terms of the workflows that I'm doing. I hope you find this useful. I'd love to hear your experiences of automation versus delegation. As I say, I'm still a fan of delegation, especially for creative tasks and especially where you are hiring someone for expertise. But where you're hiring someone to do crappy little tasks that you don't want to do yourself, I personally find it really helpful to look at how I can just get rid of those tasks by automating them away, thereby keeping my own life simpler because I have less people to deal with in order to get what I need done and just get my computer to do it for me. But let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your own experiences too. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you have feedback about the show, please email jake@thevoluntarylife.com. If you enjoyed this program, please share the podcast with your friends or click the donate button on thevoluntarylife.com.